afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Artilist webinar series. My name is Sharice Ruan, Marketing Director at Artilist. Thank you for joining us for Making Sense of CMMC 2.0, Budgeting for Cybersecurity Compliance. Today, we're joined by Artilist VP of Business Development, Christopher Barron, and Account Executive Bethany Estes to break down the tools to help you meet CMMC 2.0 and NIST 800-171 compliance and the tips to save thousands on your cybersecurity program. Feel free to submit your questions during the webinar at any time, and they will be addressed during the Q&A session at the end of this webinar. Please note that if we do not get to your question during today's session, an Artilist representative will reach out to answer your question directly. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you after today's session. If you have any questions after today's webinar, please email marketing@artilist.com. Now I'd like to turn it over to Chris and Bethany.
Yeah, thank you, Sharice, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Chris Barron, and as Sharice mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Business Development here at Artilist. I am also one of our CMMC registered practitioners and been working in one way or another with defense contractors and in this space for about the last 15 years. My role here at Artilist is to help customers understand their compliance options and really focusing around our Tesseract product, which is a comprehensive and cost-effective solution to achieving regulatory compliance. And with that, I will hand it over to Bethany to introduce herself and the organization. And we're excited about having a great webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here today. So I am a registered practitioner as well here at Artilist, an account executive, also am the BD manager. And I'm responsible for the outreach. I manage a team who some of you have probably already heard from. So our main goal is just spreading awareness and education, making sure that everyone has the kind of education out there with all the uncertainty that there is regarding CMMC. So that's our main goal and my main goal to support you guys. Artilist overall is based out of Annapolis, Maryland. That's where our HQ is, but we've been in business since 2013. We are CMMC RPOs. That stands for Registered Provider Organization and a cyber defense and digital transformation company. We build out cyber programs through a managed service. We're Microsoft Gold partners. We're actually one of 12 partners included in the Microsoft CMMC Acceleration Program. To support the defense industrial base. So we work really closely with Microsoft to help meet these requirements. And we are also federal contractors ourselves. So we're going through the same types of compliance requirements and needs that you guys are going through. So we have to be at the same spot as all of you. So that's just a little overview. Now Chris is gonna kick it into the actual substance of the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Bethany. So we're going to touch on kind of understanding contracts and requirements and what this all means for you guys. This slide here really talks a little bit about, this is an example rather of a notification that someone that we've been speaking with around, hey, they were really close on an award, and the KO came back and said, wait a second, you guys aren't compliant with DFARS 252, 242, 7019, which if you are not aware, means you need to do a self-assessment against NIST 800-171 and then upload your score into a DoD portal, the Supplier Performance Risk System. And really what this is the means for your contracting officers to be able to go and verify that you guys are compliant with the rule change that came out in November of 2020. Meaning, hey, we looked at our systems, we've got some documentation in place through the lens of an SSP or a system security plan and a plan of action and milestones, which is our plan to address controls that we're not currently meeting. And so wanted to kind of talk about this for a moment because when we're talking with a lot of folks and you may be thinking, oh, we don't do weapon systems or we're just selling some parts. This is a real life example of someone that was providing a service to another DoD entity that had nothing to do with weapons systems. Purely just they're a government contractor and need to meet this requirement. So really want to stress the importance. If you haven't already, I suspect most of you are familiar with SPRs, but if you're not, feel free to ask questions, towards the end, or reach out to Bethany, Therese, myself, and we can point you in the right direction to at least start getting, an account and start going through the process of what this looks like. It's fairly, it's a fairly easy thing to at least get started and have your score uploaded. And again, at the end of the day, we want to just make sure that everyone has an idea of what the current regulations are and what you need to be at right now. And 100%, I would recommend familiarizing yourself with the supplier performance risk system and start talking about, hey, do we have an assessment? Have we uploaded our score? What is it? Almost 9 times out of 10, this comes up as a prime, or in this case, the customer itself was asking if they've done this. Right now, there are no requirements on a minimum score, so it's just important that you've done the process and you have it uploaded. And then, as we kind of take a step back from this specific example around understanding your contracts is, one of the things we hear so much is, does this stuff affect me? Where should I be looking? And at the end of the day, it always comes down to a contract. ITAR is a really big one, right? If you've got an ITAR clause, generally that's a pretty big indicator that you're also going to be coupled with either a DFARS or a NIST 800-171 clause. The whole idea of this is around protecting CUI. So if you ask yourself, do we have CUI? If you've got a contract that has a DFARS or NIST 800-171 or ITAR clause, the answer most likely is yes, right? Because the intent of having these requirements in there is to protect CUI. And so this starts all the way, back at just a FAR clause, right? So the Federal Acquisition Regulations. Everyone that contracts with the government has a FAR clause at the bare minimum, which is an equivalent to about a CMMC level 1. So we always recommend to our customers to go back and look through the contracts and see what's actually in front of you. You're probably not going to have something that says, hey, you have to be at CMMC, but you're very more than likely going to have something that says you got to meet FAR 52-204 or DFARS 252-204 2012, or this 7019 around an audit. And then for those of you that may or may not know, NIST 800-171 is inclusive of the common DFARS clauses that you see. So really, it all starts about when you're asking yourself, do we have to do this? What's it look like right now? We always point back to understanding your contracts, and if you have these clauses, you definitely want to pay a little bit of attention to them and start understanding, where you're at. And then from a budgetary perspective, that's really where this thing starts to open up, and we can start getting closer to helping you identify a budget depending on what clause you have, right? If it's just FAR, it's a little bit lighter weight, roughly about 17 things you need to be doing, versus if you have a DFARS or NIST 800-171 clause, they become a bit more intensive and saying, hey, you got to be doing the things around NIST 800-171. Happy to answer any questions, either during the Q&A or, if you'd like to schedule a follow-on call to help understand what these requirements are. And then, from a perspective of the technology you're using, it's important to understand if any SaaS products you're using are FedRAMPed. And then also at the end of the day, right, the name of the game here is CUI. One of the questions we get asked often is, what is CUI? That's something that, your provider should be able to help train you on and help your folks understand what it is so you can label it and treat it appropriately. But at the end of the day, if you have one of these clauses, DFARS, NIST, obviously ITAR, it's in there because the customer expects you to be either creating CUI or be in receipt of CUI or processing it. And then that's where these things really start to impact you. So that's usually one of the main things we see is what's CUI, where do we need to start, and doing a self-assessment and getting your score uploaded into SPRS is 100% one of the first places to start. And so with that, I will turn things over to Bethany to talk a little bit about understanding environment options and some of the different licensing.
Right. Okay. So understanding your environment and your options is really important. And here's a really good chart to kind of look at to go into more what kinds of requirements might be applying to you and how you would choose that environment. So if you look at the commercial and GCC, there's a couple things that you'll be able to meet compliancy with, but again, the name of the game here is going to be that CUI and even that ITAR. So that's why it's highlighted that GCC High there is because GCC High is a really, really good environment that was actually created to meet these DoD and federal contractor needs. This meets the standards of NIST 800-171, the FedRAMP High, ITAR, anyone who wants to manage CUI, CDI. It's actually technically a copy of the DoD cloud. You cannot handle ITAR or most CUI on commercial just because of the requirement of needing it to be all US-based personnel. And that's a really key thing to hone in on, is the fact that to be able to handle this types of information is making sure that everything is US-based as far as the personnel being able to access that information. Microsoft has spent like $5 billion just in the past year in research, just trying to make sure that they can put enough research into the environment that they're creating to be able to handle this information. And that effort is only going up. So there's also a little bit of if you're talking about cost and budgeting and what things to consider here. It is around 40% more expensive to get on GCC High than the commercial or GCC. And it really is because of that US base that I was talking about. They can't outsource any sort of work overseas. So it's all, because it's all US based, it makes it a little more expensive. But it still is going to be a more cost effective way to control these environments, because it's better than taking a bunch of different technologies and trying to put them into one stack, whereas Microsoft does a really good job at creating its own sovereign environment. And Chris, if you want to go jump to the next slide, we'll go over some of your licensing options. So here, like it's not just like all GCC High is the same. There's a lot of different options. Sometimes we'll run into people who are already on GCC High and maybe they have like E1, E3, those types of licensing. And when it comes to NIST and CMMC, things like that, it's just not sufficient enough. You're gonna need a little bit more requirements put into your licensing than that. So we have recommendations. One of our recommendations is going to be more comprehensive. We have just one license stack that is very easy. It eliminates having to pull any other sorts of technologies together. But there's also web-based options that are more cost-effective. And at the end of the day, it's really up to you and your business operations on if you want to have like desktop apps, or do you want to be web-based? Is that going to work for you? Because that is actually a little cheaper sometimes to have a web-based option. And we'd be happy to talk through our recommendations as well if anyone would be wanting to have more depth conversation on what those recommendations would be. Also, kind of another thing to note as well is like a hybrid option. So the biggest thing about this is really digging into how many people are going to be using or going to be accessing CUI or handling it, and figuring out if can you break up your user count per se into this amount of people are going to be handling CUI, and this amount of people are just commercial. They're not going to be seeing CUI at all, and there's actually it's actually pretty easy. We even run on hybrid ourselves, so it's pretty easy to do a hybrid model. There's a couple like questions to be asking yourself, like do we plan on going fully federal work? So if you're gonna maybe in the future migrate all of your users to having to be able to handle that CUI, then maybe it wouldn't be a good idea. But if there really is like a good split of these people see CUI, these people are just handling typical day-to-day commercial business, then maybe it'd be good to do a hybrid model, and that's going to be a lot more cost effective. And so that's another thing that like we'd be happy to help with, help figuring out, you know, who's going to be actually seeing it, who's going to be touching it, and then looking also into like contracts again. Like we'll probably keep reiterating the contract thing because a lot of it is very contract dependent. But that's why, like, when choosing a partner, making sure that you know, they can help you figure out what kind of language to look for, and like help explain like what that CUI might be, things like that. So now we're going to jump into understanding that migration portion of it.
Yeah, thanks, Bethany. And just to add here as well, obviously there's a lot of tiles on this. Don't expect you to be able to read them all. But, you know, as Bethany mentioned, the reason we recommend Microsoft 365 E5 because it addresses the most controls without having to go elsewhere. There's also a link when you guys get a copy of this deck that will take you to m365maps.com. We find that to be one of the best tools out there for understanding what capabilities and Microsoft product are within each license. I'm sure we've all kind of gone down and beaten our heads about what does this license include? Why doesn't Microsoft make it easy? I think Microsoft, or at least a singular employee at Microsoft, got tired of being asked those questions as well. A gentleman by the name of Aaron Dinage. So he maintains the site and updates all the different capabilities as they come online. And then if you're looking at from a website, you can say, oh, what is, you know, Microsoft Defender? And you can go and click on it and it'll tell you exactly what that capability is. Also wanted to add, as Bethany mentioned, from a hybrid or cost-effective perspective, is it's important to have an understanding on if you have folks that are working at customer sites and if they're only on government furnished equipment. The DoD has classified those folks as specialized assets. Obviously, we can't put sensors or agents on a government machine, but that drastically changes the scope of what you all are looking at as well. So if you have folks that are working at a government facility on government equipment, aren't really accessing a whole lot of company information, they are what the DoD would consider a specialized asset. So no, we don't need to do everything that we're doing for everyone, for the corporate employees for them, but we need to write some policy to them, and that's another way to look at from a cost-effective standpoint. So thank you, Bethany. And I will jump into understanding migrations, particularly from a cost perspective. Right, and so as you start looking at a migration, you know, it's all about getting the environment and the data you need that's currently on either an on-premise server or on-premise infrastructure, or maybe you're in Microsoft Commercial, and moving that data that's needed to be restricted from a compliance perspective into potentially GCC high or a new environment. And so there's a number of different cost considerations that we want to talk through about what this looks like. You know, I could sit back and say, at the end of the day, if you're already on Microsoft Commercial and only are using OneDrive and SharePoint and your email, moving it into GCC high is really straightforward. You know, obviously those cases are generally few and far between. There's a bit more as you start peeling back the layers of the onion. Do we have some on-premise infrastructure? Are we using some sort of file server? Do we have a legacy data system that now needs to be brought up into a FedRAMP environment? Okay, so these are all the things that will generally be cost considerations as you're planning your migration. One of the things that will also be important to look through, you know, in terms of choosing your provider from a cost-effective standpoint, is if there are significant or upfront charges, whether it's implementation or some folks call it onboarding, right? That's what you want to look at and see if there's a large CapEx to even just get started, or if it's blended into the service itself. Another thing to point out from a cost perspective, from a migration standpoint, is, you know, again, like I mentioned, mail, files, stuff like that is generally easy to move over. When we start getting into complex workflows, or if you have business processes that need to be replicated, or complex Teams environments if you're using Microsoft Teams. That is certainly ways that are going to be cost drivers for how this wants to be handled. So it's important to work with a partner that understands, hey, just because you have a current state Teams environment or whatever your collaboration tool is, how can we look to improve it and refine it in the new instance, so we're not just bringing bad or junk into the new tenant that folks are using. Typically what we'll see is, if folks are on Microsoft Commercial or they're on Google or they're on, Office 2016, they're moving that data from a commercial environment into a GCC environment or a GCC high environment is another cost, right? You have to migrate that data from one to the other. There's not a clean way to go about it. And so as you're looking through, hey, do we need to be on GCC high now? Just keep in mind, if you choose to stay on commercial or choose to just go to GCC, again, these are all decisions that a partner can help you understand the risk and what makes sense for you all. Is in the back of your mind say, okay, if we don't go into GCC high now, but we know it's coming, just keep in mind that it's going to be another migration. And then the whole idea with this is, when a user or an employee comes in and logs in on that Monday, or whenever the organization chooses that, hey, we're going live with this new environment, that it looks very similar to what they're at before, right? Their mailbox is there, their calendars are there, their contacts are there, their files, their data. And again, so every time you have to move that, generally there's going to be a fee there. So at the end of the day, you may look at this and say, hey, I know GCC high is a little bit more expensive, but we're going to be future-proof, and we don't necessarily have to pay a migration fee again. Then outside of just moving data over, you want to look at how's this new environment going to be set up to meet these controls. As Bethany mentioned, right, our general recommendation for organizations is to move to a Microsoft M365 E5 license, and again, because that addresses the most controls. And so when you look at that, how do now we set all this stuff up so we can be compliant, and so we can have policy written to how the system and the user should be behaving. So again, all different considerations you want to look for, and then at the end of the day, you want to look at, hey, is this provider charging for an onboarding and setup fee, which is going to generally relate to a CapEx, or are they blending it in throughout the term of the agreement and the partnership, turning it more into an OpEx? So again, very happy to work with anyone in terms of understanding from a cash flow perspective, flexible options, etc. I think that's about it. Again, if you have on-premise legacy items, there's certain use cases where those need to stay. We just want to be talking about them. We want to understand what's there, have a total picture, and then start looking at, hey, what's the new state going to look like? And if there's any other questions on migration or configuration or onboarding, feel free to put them in the chat and we can address them, or we can set up another time to chat. All right. So one of the things I want to talk about a little bit now is around our shared responsibility matrix, and really, as the title says here, understanding who does what. We strive to be comprehensive and cost effective, and the idea here is that so you don't have to go and hire a bunch of new people or bring in multiple service providers. And so when you bring that stuff together, not only is there generally an economy of scale, you also have all those different functions and different and different expertise working together, to move the ball down the field in terms of a unity of effort. So what was historically, hey, I needed to have a point product for, alerts and monitoring, or somebody else that's going to do consulting, or somebody else that's going to write our policy. These are either folks that, as an organization, you need to hire or work with a partner to do. Generally speaking, when you work with a partner that does all these things, it's going to be significantly more cost effective than, a number of different vendors or hiring out a number of different service providers. And so, one of the things we want to talk about a little bit particularly from a shared responsibility perspective is, the DoD is really pushing for this term of inheritance, control inheritance. And industry as a whole, and particularly us, we get really excited about this. And the whole argument is, hey, if a organization or a managed service provider is out there and they've got a product or a solution that addresses all of the controls or a portion of the controls, you really want to be saying, hey, if this provider has done these things, has written this policy, has configured an environment to this level, what we really want to focus on is having the DCMA audit those processes and those controls so they don't have to do it again for the end user. So if you were to look at, our Tesseract product, and if it were to go through and meet DCMA compliance, or from a C3PAO, you're going to look at this and say the government doesn't want to double check work, right? If it's already been validated, we can then inherit those controls down to the end user that's using this service or this product. And what that's really critical for, and the intent here, is that it makes audits significantly less expensive and a lot quicker, right? And you can look and say, okay, these controls are covered by this component of the shared responsibility matrix. We know that this provider is doing these things. We're able, and it's already been validated by DCMA or a C3PAO. And those audits are generally going to be time and materials. And so, the quicker you can move through some of these controls that are already have inheritance, the less time an auditor needs to spend with you guys. And which is really exciting because, no one wants to have duplication of effort. And now if you're able to inherit your provider's controls, that's a really powerful component of achieving CMMC or NIST compliance. So certainly wanted to point that out. And then back to the shared responsibility matrix, right? That's what they're going to be looking at. They're going to say, okay, here's the control. Here's the qualifying criteria that we want to see to be able to, for that control to be met, and who's going to do it. And so, when we work with our customers, we outlay all of the things you have to do. And so you want to be looking at, hey, do we see everything from a total picture of all the stuff we need to do, and then start filling in the tiles, so to speak, of who's doing what. Not only is this important from an auditing perspective, but if any of you folks on the line have been around the DoD a while, I'm sure you've heard about what a RACI is: responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. It's just very helpful for if there's an issue, or if you want to know who's who in the zoo. Hey, you pull this up and you say, okay, this responsibility falls on X, right? And the more buttoned up you're able to have that documentation and that process, the better you're going to be able to move through an audit, and the better, more importantly, the better you're going to be able to work as an organization. You're going to know who's going to be responsible, who's going to be accountable, who's going to be consulted, and who's going to be informed. And so those are some terms that we really like to discuss with folks about, hey, who's doing what here? And so everyone has a very clear understanding of what this service or solution is going to look like. There's nothing worse than, I'm sure we've all been there, of when, you buy something and it wasn't necessarily exactly what you thought. We find that it's very important, in terms of choosing your provider, to walk through that exercise so everyone is on the same page. Again, would love some questions as that stuff comes up. Really the highlights there around reciprocity, inheritance of the controls, and an understanding of just who's doing what. Let's see here. And this next slide here is just an example of a shared responsibility matrix. We've got I believe it was the C3PAO kind of governing body put together a little bit of a white paper on what a shared responsibility should look like. So, it's going to have the service provider information, and it's going to get down to the control level, and then ultimately the assessment criteria. And then when you have the shared responsibility matrix, you really want to start filling this stuff in about who's responsible for what. And again, as we start talking through inheritance, who's doing what? Oh, I thought you were going to be making patch updates. No, we are, right? So on and so forth. So as you start going through it, there's also a link to this great report that just came out the other week around the importance and what a good shared responsibility matrix should look like. Again, at the end of the day, from a cost perspective, the sooner you can move through an audit, the more impactful and cost effective it's going to be. And with that, I will hand it over to Bethany.
So evaluating your service provider. So there's a couple different things to look at here, and making sure that if you decide that you want to look at like a partner, someone to help you out with this, what should you be looking for so that you can find the most comprehensive and cost-effective solution? First thing here, are they a registered provider organization? That just means that are they authorized to represent this organization as familiar with the basic constructs of CMMC standards. They have a CMMC ID provided logo. It signifies that you've also agreed to the CMMC ID Code of Professional Conduct. So they've gone through a lot of extensive, they pay for this. They go through training. It gives them that credibility behind their name, that they have the knowledge to be able to consult on this. Do they have a registered practitioner that works for them? To be an RPO, you have to actually at least still have an RP on staff as well. And this registered practitioner is trained personnel on CMMC, and they themselves as individuals have agreed to the CMMC ID Code of Conduct, professional conduct, and they represent themselves as familiar with basic constructs of the CMMC standard. And then just to touch on, Chris already kind of talked a little bit about this, so I won't go super deep into it, but are they targeting those inheritance controls? Are they a part of the CMMC acceleration program? Do they have some sort of someone backing them up, someone that is behind their name as well? Like Microsoft, for us, puts their name behind us and says, yeah, they know what they're doing. We are one of 12 partners with Microsoft. Do they have that type of credibility behind their name so that you know that other people are pushing them out there as well, knowing that they know what they're doing? Are they government contractors themselves? Do they have to meet the same types of requirements as you? Do they understand what you're going through? A lot of people, and this kind of touches on the next point here as well, a lot of people might just focus on resale, which is fine, but they don't necessarily know how to actually maintain these environments. They don't know how to support the environment that they're putting you in. Do they have to meet these standards themselves? And I kind of just touched on this, but do they focus on the product resale, or do they actually have some sort of support system? A lot of people will come to us who have already kind of, like the GCC High platform that I talked about, they'll already be on GCC High, and then they don't really know what to do with it. They don't know how to turn the controls and practices on. They're kind of a little stuck because they worked with someone who only provided that. So making sure that, if you are going to go the route of getting onto this licensing, either do you know how to control that environment, or do you need support and do you need help in that? And honestly, the next couple of slides will even touch on this a little bit more as well. So for the struggles of effective risk management, I'll go through these questions here to the side. So does your provider provide SOC support? A lot of times, to be able to meet CMMC requirements, you have to be able to create an entire SOC, which just doesn't make sense for smaller businesses, especially like under 1,000 employees. It's just not really the resources that you want to spend your time and money on, is creating your own SOC. So can they support things like having a vCISO, MSSP, MSP? How can you eliminate the need to pull a bunch of different resources together to save money and provide a seamless experience? So can you pull all of these different avenues together yourself? Can you pull the different, like, can you do the policy writing? Can you do the configurations, hardening, defending? Can you do all these things? Or you're going to need help with that, so that, you don't break operations, and that you're still be able to function as a business as well. Making sure that your provider is providing more than a list of controls and practices. So this is kind of what I was talking about with the licensing just being a resale, and making sure that they're not just kind of throwing you into the deep end. They're giving you guidance. They're at least giving you assistance and consulting with you on how to manage this environment. It's not just you set your environment up, you're good to go. There's a lot more that goes into it. I actually have just spoke to someone today who they were kind of like, so what do you do once you get compliant? And you don't really there's audits to pass and things. There's assessments that you have to go through, but it's not just kind of a one and done. There's a lot of living, breathing things that go into it. Your policy is living and breathing. There's monitoring that you have to do, incident response plans, and a lot of stuff that doesn't just stop and you don't just you're compliant, good to go. It's very continuous. And then our managed services is limited to just monitoring. So sometimes if you have a managed service who might not be an RPO, or they're just not really honed in on the standards of CMMC, they might just use typical defending services. So do they have other things that they could offer? So maybe training, configuration, asset management. Do they have a vulnerability management program? Do they do backups for you? Can they provide you with the security architecture? Did they give you an incident response plan? Do you know what you would do if there was an incident? A lot of different things. So just kind of keeping in mind all these different puzzle pieces together. And Christy can move to the next slide as well. It'll see how you can pull these puzzle pieces together to create a comprehensive approach, like that policy, policy and practicing consulting. That goes along with your SSP, system security plan, and your plan of action and milestones. So can they write the policy that goes along with CMMC? The logging, monitoring, reporting, alerting, are they doing this? And kind of all the the previous slide when I was talking about making sure that that everything is continuous and that they're continuing to do logging and monitoring, hardening, and making sure you have your security architecture, making sure you have that defense, service, and response plan, and then making sure you have support. And another really important key thing about that support is, do you have someone who you can go to and they can give you an answer? Honestly, just basics of it. Can they provide you support? Do they know what they're doing? Do they meet with you regularly? Do they walk through configurations with you? Do they know the verbiage to put on contracts? All this stuff that is really important to either to be looking for in a provider, or at least sitting down and seeing if this is something that you can do internally. Just from what we've seen, it's just a lot more cost effective to pull this into a partnership. And because of that, we've seen, at least the way we've been able to price things out, it's less than an FTE to be able to do all of these things for you for 3 years. So making sure that, looking at what would it cost to just hire one person to be able to do all of this stuff, or what would it cost to actually partner with someone and see how much it would be for them to actually go in and do these things. Because a lot of times, everyone knows about the wholesale, like Costco. There's the approach to outsourcing and finding someone who has the expertise. They've already gone into knowing how to work this, knowing what the requirements are, it could just be cheaper. But, you know, again, ultimately it's up to you. It's depending on your business operations and your business practices, making sure that you can find the right comprehensive approach for your business.
Yeah, and to add on that too a little bit, Bethany, is, you know, you may be looking at this or other providers say, oh, we already have people that do this, or we already have another provider, and that's great. Most MSPs should be diligent of that, of not disrupting existing business relationships, as long as you know, they're doing things the right way, right? And so, you know, one of the things you want to look at as well, from a comprehensive perspective, is, are we looking at the totality of what our internal capabilities are, if we have any other providers, and then are there flexible options around, okay, we have someone that's doing this, how do we start, you know, working together in terms of being able to satisfy the requirements with existing relationships. So flexibility is an important thing to look at in terms of, you know, choosing your service provider. All right. And so when we look at building a cost-effective solution here, you know, we talked a little bit around, you know, one of the questions we get a lot is, you know, maybe we're going to, you know, do this ourselves, or we're going to, we've got some providers and we're going to hire other providers. You know, you start looking at the numbers here, and, you know, doing it yourself, certainly at a certain point in an organization's growth, you may have some of those staff or capabilities on hand. And so what we've tried to do here is put together some just average salaries around what, you know, an InfoSec program manager and a vCISO looks like, what having a MSP looks like, what having an MDR looks like. And so we've tried to put some of these numbers together in terms of, hey, are we gonna hire, you know, a handful of full-time employees to be able to do this? Generally, the answer is it doesn't make sense. Or at the end of the day, do you look at this and say, hey, do we bring together a team of expertise at a fraction of the cost, and what generally comes out to be less expensive than, you know, just one full-time employee. So you look at now having a team of experts versus maybe just one. And so from a cost-effective perspective, you know, we got the thumbs up there on the right around bundling all of this together, right? You guys know how this works. You're certainly going to see economies of scale, you know, when you bring in one partner or two versus multiple. And then this aligns right with what we were talking about with Microsoft. And one of the reasons we really promote what Microsoft does, as Bethany mentioned, right, no one else is spending anywhere near the amount of money of what they're doing in terms of research and development, and then baking those capabilities into their solution, right? And so the majority of folks are on, you know, Microsoft is as is. So you look at this and say, okay, do we up-level our licensing and get all this capability? Similar to that, you say, hey, do we up-level our you know, managed service footprint and say, hey, we're going to get all this great stuff, not have to stay up at night, and we know that someone is going to be able to handle this for us. From a totality perspective, that's one of the things I really want to stress on of, hey, there's stuff out there of, you know, we may address 10 controls or 20 controls or 50 controls. You know, ideally what you want to look at is who's got an answer for all this stuff. And again, that drives down to a cost-effective solution. Kind of to again reiterate, you know, if you start adding up all this number, this can be upwards of, you know, $500,000 just to be able to bring in these capabilities or hire different service providers. Again, you want to look at from a cost-effective perspective what makes the most sense for us. Let's see here. We've got getting ahead of myself here. Another thing you want to look at too is, you know, are there flexible payment options, right? You know, I talked a little bit at the beginning of how do we turn this into an OpEx versus a CapEx? Are there, you know, significant onboarding or upfront costs? Or are we able to, you know, pay for this monthly, or are we getting discounts? How do we manage this from a cash flow perspective? And that's one of the things we want to talk about a lot is, the importance here is at least getting starting to get informed of the budget, and then you all have the tools and the information you need to make a business decision on which way you want to go. I'm not going to sit here and say everyone needs to, just outsource all of this, because that's not necessarily realistic, but you want to make sure you have all the information you need. Also, one of the things we get asked a lot is, how much of this stuff do we need to do? And, oftentimes it depends on the contract, depends on where you all are at from a budgetary perspective. And again, this is where if you can start planning and you can get started, and as long as you have your evaluation in, you've got your score uploaded in SPRS, you're able to have a little bit clearer picture on what things are going to look like 3, 6, 12, 18 months down the road, and what you need to start getting together from a financial perspective, and what this stuff is going to cost. Flexible payment options. I touched on that a little bit. And then, one of the other things that's important is speed. As I mentioned, I had that use case at the top of the call of someone that reached out and said, hey, the government's holding up a contract because I haven't done this. How quickly and responsive is the partner you're working with? Does it take weeks to get an answer or get a quote, or can they turn things around pretty quickly? Right, and so that's one of the things that you want to look for is responsiveness and how quickly folks are able to provide you information you need. Being able to get pricing quickly, especially if you're up against a timeline, is very important. At the same time, it's very critical that you start budgeting for this stuff and start having a plan immediately. As of now, CMMC is not law, right? But NIST 800-171 and DFARS certainly are, right? And so one of the changes with CMMC 2.0 is that CMMC 2.0 is simply a mechanism to validate that you're meeting the controls within NIST 800-171. And so they've kind of simplified it a little bit. And so you want to start looking at, hey, what's it going to take for us to get there? Where are we now? And how soon do we need to get started? And if you've got a budget, you can go to your leadership team and say, hey, this is what we need to do to get an award, and this is what it's going to cost. You're going to be much better armed for that conversation versus just getting started maybe when a contract comes out and you think you're going to get an award and they come to you and say, hey, you haven't uploaded your score yet. So we always recommend at least having a plan. And having a plan is essentially free, right? You should be able to get a plan at least from any provider on what you're looking for fairly quickly and fairly inexpensively. And then, so from a getting started perspective, there's a couple of different tools that we have out there. I encourage you to look at, right? We've got an evaluation tool, an assessment tool where you can run through it either, by yourself or with an expert on our staff, and at least get an idea of where you're at from a score. If you haven't done that, I highly encourage you to do so. Again, back through the lens of planning and understanding what you're looking at. This has been a really helpful tool for a lot of folks to get a sense of where they're at and where they need to go. And so we've got some resources available. Just if you want to click that and go through it, great. Also happy to jump on there and help understand some of the requirements. We know better than anyone that a lot of these requirements and controls can be fairly ambiguous and maybe left for interpretation. We're happy to help kind of clear some of that mud. Also, we provide free consultations, right? So we'll do that self-assessment tool with you for free. We're happy to meet and talk through a little bit about what your program looks like, how you can get started. We really just want to understand your own knowledge of the requirements in front of you, and how you need to go about getting started. And I think with that, we can close out. We've got our contact information over here. We will send all of you a copy of this deck, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
All right, thank you both. We are now beginning the Q&A portion of our webinar. If you have a question, please submit it through the question feature. Please note if we do not get to your question during today's session, an Artist representative will reach out to answer your question directly. Now let's begin with our first question. How much would it cost to do this internally?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so, the easy answer is it depends. But at the end of the day, you start looking at all of the controls, and you want to be able to point to, you at least want to start with what's all the stuff we need to do, and then you start layering in what your internal capabilities are. And so in terms of doing this yourself, we generally highlight 3 key pillars around governance, right? Governance is all about policy writing, kind of that virtual CISO who's setting up the overall strategy, conducting business sessions and risk assessments with the organization, what things are going to cost, and then tying business objectives to how your program and your people should be behaving. So that's generally one person, right? A policy or a compliance or an overall, C-level type person, whether it's information security or information officer, right? Where we start going with this. So that's generally one hire. That is, anywhere from it's a mid 6-figure range at least. Then you start looking at hardening, right? How are we going to harden our systems? This is traditionally a sysadmin, maybe a network engineer, who knows the system and how to configure it and be able to respond to vulnerabilities and push patches and configuration management and baselining, kind of general IT security operations. That's generally another person, right? And so depending on where you are in the country, again, those folks are really hard to come by. You have to train them. You have to pay them for benefits. You have to recruit them. You have to retain them. It's kind of a joke in the information security space is that employees are just training their competitors' next hire, right? And so where does it make sense to bring that person on? And then lastly, if you start looking at IT cyber operations or just cyber operations as a whole from a 24/7 monitoring perspective, now you're looking at a team of at least 3 folks, right? No one can work 24 hours a day. So if you need to have someone monitoring, you're looking at, generally at least 3 hires, and that's not even considering, vacations or leave or what have you. And so when you start looking at this, generally to do it yourself, the estimates are around $600,000.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What if you have older on-premise equipment that exists primarily to support legacy products and customers that have CUI data that can't be part of GCC High and can't be updated? What can you do here to meet CMMC requirements?
Yeah, that's another good question. And so a lot of that falls within, how people use that system. It could just be a matter of, hey, maybe that provider has a new cloud offering, or at the end of the day, maybe we can take that on-premise infrastructure and host it in something like Azure Government Cloud, where we are getting some of that inheritance from a FedRAMP perspective. At the end of the day, if you have significant legacy or on-premise infrastructure, highly encourage you to reach out to a program advisor or a representative at Artist or another provider to talk through and plan for how you're going to start future-proofing that. There's certainly many cases where that stuff can stay and it's fine. Generally, some of the things we want to look at moving into a cloud right away are email. Right? There's been a lot of news around on-premise Exchange, and then you have to have the people there to keep it up to date. Microsoft rolls out different end of life. One of the beauties of moving things to a cloud environment is that you're always getting the latest and greatest functionality and security updates and patching. Again, it depends, but there's a way to work things that need to stay on premise versus, hey, what makes sense to move to the cloud. At the end of the day, it may not make sense to do it all at once, but again, I'll reiterate that you want to have a plan on, hey, this is either going to stay here, and this is how we're going to instrument and write policy around it, or hey, maybe in 6 or 12 months we're going to look at moving this to something a little bit more future-proof in the cloud.
Are there any updates on government reimbursement for the cost of implementing this?
Yeah, that's one that that's one of the most common questions we have. So a couple things there. There's a couple of different funding mechanisms out there depending on the types of contracts you're on. I know, for instance, if folks are working on SBIR awards, there's a line in there called TABA, Technical and Business Assistance. We've got customers that have applied for that and gotten it, and they're paying for their cyber programs in its entirety for that. Back to kind of DoD at large, there's been a number of questions about, hey, how are we going to pay for this? This is expensive. There's a couple different things that we see. One of them that I'll point out from a business advantage perspective is, if you're leaning into this and you have a plan and you understand what it's going to cost from a budgetary perspective, you're now able to competitively price your cyber program as a line item, just like you would your professional services or other capabilities that you're providing for your customers. So again, back to this awareness and this education, the better armed you are with what things cost, the more competitive you'll be able to be, and not be in the red after you get an award, maybe because you underbid a cyber line item. We expect that that will be the most common mechanism for funding in terms of, hey, price this into your contract. What's your line item for cyber program costs or CMMC or compliance? And again, the better suited you are to be able to provide a specific number and point to an invoice, the more competitive you'll be able to be in terms of your pricing.
Okay.
And more to come.
Last question, how long are service contracts usually?
Yeah, our service contracts are typically 3 years. And the reason that we do that is, from a CMMC 2.0 perspective, every 3 years you need to be audited. And then every year you need to do a self-assessment, right? And again, so partners will be there with you to be able to facilitate those conversations. So generally they're 3 years. That also is pretty critical in terms of if you're doing monthly payments or paying all at once. It allows us more flexibility from a discounting perspective and flexible payment options. And then, if you want to do something like a 1 year, we just look at that and it's generally a different price. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you have flexible options to see what makes the most sense for you all as an organization.
Awesome. Thank you for such a great discussion today. We have now concluded today's session. If we did not get to your question, again, an Ardalis representative will reach out to answer your question directly. We will be sending follow-up emails with the webinar recording, as well as some other helpful resources on the topics covered here today. If you have any additional questions or need information, please feel free to reach us at marketing@ardalis.com, and we will be happy to assist. If you're looking for more information on Ardalis and our services, please visit us online at www.ardalis.com. Thank you for joining us for Making Sense of CMMC 2.0 Budgeting for Cybersecurity Compliance, and we look forward to seeing you next time at the Ardalis webinar series.
Thanks, everyone.